Today I'm speaking with Will Thorpe. Will, thank you so much for joining me today.
Hello, hello.
I appreciate your joining me today. And where are you located today, by the way?
I am from West Melbourne, Florida.
Nice, nice.
It's about a half hour south of Cocoa Beach.
Okay. I was going to ask that, do you all ever see manatees?
Yes, we do. To be honest, we see more manatees at Disney. But yes, we do see manatees fairly regularly out in the wild. In fact, during the winter, they like to come into our canals to get warm. And so you'll see like 100 floating manatees all piled up on top of each other in this little teeny tiny channel because the water is so warm and shallow.
That's funny. That's funny. Well, for anyone who doesn't know Will, just give a real quick bio here. Will was a Christian for 20 years, fundamentalist for 15, and then from an evangelical becoming more of a liberal Christian for 5 years, and then deconverting, which we're going to talk about today. He started doubting the Bible and his faith in 2019 and became an atheist at the end of the year. So I beat you by about 2 or 3 months. We're right at the same time. And mine was September of 2019. And he likes to discuss the historicity of the Bible, textual criticism, and to question evangelical theology. He's married for 11 years. He and his wife have 2 birds. And again, they live down in Florida near Disney, and they're running enthusiasts. And last thing I know as well, before I ask you to fill in more about this, is you have a platform that you call Heretical Theology. So I was going to ask if you could to give us more background on yourself, and then tell us, what is heretical theology all about?
Yeah, so heretical. So the idea is that there is some irony being an atheist talking about theology, and that theology is obviously very heretical compared to mainstream Christianity. And of course, there's what we consider orthodox, Christianity and orthodox theology. Of course, a Pentecostal is going to be heretical to a Catholic, and so that's kind of like the absurdity that I like to hit on. And so I look at what the Bible claims. I try to get to the history of what the Bible claims, and I analyze the history and I scrutinize the biblical text in line with what history says. So I have a quote that's been kind of like a motto on my page, and that is that theology without history equals fantasy. And what that essentially means is you can have all the theological beliefs that you want. However, if there is no history to validate those claims, at the minimum, let alone scientific or even just philosophical, then there's no difference between you believing in a God and it being complete fantasy. So, for example, if Jesus literally did rise from the dead and we had, complete solid evidence for that, that would be a historical theology. And I would separate that from what is fantasy. So I discuss theology kind of like how a Star Wars enthusiast like myself would discuss Star Wars. I talk about Jedi and Sith as if they actually exist. I know they don't actually exist, but I still talk about them, and I get excited about it. It's no different from when I talk about the Bible, and I point out things that a lot of evangelicals are typically not that familiar with. And when I show what the history says and what the text says using textual criticism, the conclusions tend to be quite heretical, and I stand by them. I'm not always right, but then again, I don't think they're right either. I'm simply trying to give them their viewpoint on what could very probably be the truth. Whether it's actually truth or not, I don't know. A lot of times I do, but not all the time. And I just try to get people to think critically about the things that they claim to believe.
That's awesome. Well, I do want to dive into that a little bit more toward the end, after we do talk about your more of your personal story. But before we get into that, is there anything else in terms of a bio that we don't know about you yet that we should? You mentioned Star Wars. We know you're a Star Wars enthusiast.
I am a Star Wars enthusiast. Trying to think of things. I'm pretty boring. I mean, I wake up at between 4 and 5 a.m. every morning, and I go to bed at 8 or 9. Like it's crazy. I like to work out. I like to run. I have a couple Spartan races coming up in February. I'm pretty excited about. Also have a background in graphic design, so in my free time, I've been learning 3D modeling, and so I downloaded a free copy or a program called Blender, and it's a 3D modeling program. And I'm right now in the very beginning stages of learning how to make my first virtual donut.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
I'm,
it's pretty
I'm
cool.
jealous of your graphics abilities. I'm on the very, very fringe of that. Obviously, I can put a really basic video together, but in terms of like using After Effects or all that stuff, I've got a lot to learn. But I'm dipping my feet in the water, so I'm excited
There
to
you go.
go down that path myself.
Adobe
Well,
is great software to know.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm more of one of the. I'm at the level of I know enough to be dangerous, so I often have to. I'll do a few things and then I'll do something that messes the whole thing up,
Yeah,
and I can't.
yeah, and to those listening, you said we have birds, and I have to apologize to all the listeners here on your behalf. I'm sorry if you happen to hear birds in the background. I've done my best to try to prevent that. I've listened to a couple of my other podcasts I've been on, and they're very vocal, so I do apologize if they're in the background.
Like a parakeet or something like that.
That is so the smallest one is the loudest one, or at least the most frequent, and then the conure, his name is Kiwi. The parakeet's Finn. They're on my Instagram stories fairly often. So we have a parakeet named Finn. We have a conure named Kiwi. They're our babies, and they're just like siblings. The parakeet is the annoying little brother, and Kiwi is the big brother who doesn't want anything to do with him, and he gets grumpy and he squawks really loud on occasion, and the Keat just kind of squawks happily pretty much all the time.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, could you walk us back to your origin story? Where did obviously we know you were a Christian for 20 years, but when you were growing up, was I assume your parents were believers? Is that fair to say?
More or less. I mean, they were the C&E Christians, for some Christianese terminology right there for you folks. If those who don't know, they were kind of like Christian and Easter Christians. I'm sorry, Christmas and Easter Christians. And
you said they're Methodists.
Correct. Yeah. So they were Methodists. So when I was 5, they took me to I was raised in a very rural country town. Like I literally had a cornfield in my backyard, and then across
Awesome.
the street there was a soybean field, and I literally walked down the alley like a quarter of a mile, and then down behind some houses to get to the church. Or I could have walked straight through the middle of the cornfield and got there, straight. It was I went to Sunday school when I was 5. I loved it because I was a kid who had nothing better to do than to play with Legos by myself. And so I thought it was awesome. And my mom started going to that church as well, as did my dad. My mother says I was saved at 7 at altar call. I don't really remember it. And then fast forward to middle school, I met this church who was meeting in our lecture hall within the high school area. Because I have a very, very small high school, middle school is all one building, and the elementary as well. And was wondering what they were doing. Saw some cute girls in there. I'm like, what's going on? Like, it was an after school thing. I think I had wrestling practice. And so I got interested. And so I started going there to talk about the book of Daniel and Revelation and end times, like crazy, awesome stuff. I'm like, this is fascinating. I don't hear about this in a Methodist church. And so they had a real good youth group. So I started going there. My parents wanted me to go there as well because I'm actually learning the Bible. They have a great youth group. And so I started going to both churches. And then eventually I started going to the Bible teaching church full time. I was a 16-year-old. And I actually got saved at 14 at Abstinence Camp, a summer camp that I used to go to a lot as a kid, which I actually was a camp counselor for 3 summers too.
Did you say it's called Abstinence Camp?
Yeah, it was an abstinence weekends.
Awesome.
So basically you take a bunch of hormonal, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old kids, and you teach them not to have, and it's an overnight camp for 2 nights, and you teach them not to have sex with each other. Yeah, it seemed counterproductive in hindsight, but whatever. And I had a gospel presentation. Long story short, I accepted Christ, and it was during a painting with music and stuff. And needless to say, I felt God kind of tap me on the shoulder and heard his voice, like, what are you doing? I'm like, I don't know. He's like, are you ready to start following me? I'm like, yes, God, I'll start following you. So I did that, and super, super fast forward. Met my wife, went to Iraq, came back, got married, went back to Iraq, came back. My wife is unhappy with the church. She was Catholic. Now she's going to my church with me. And she wants to move, so we go down to Florida for our 5-year anniversary. My brother just became a Christian at that time. We visit his church. She's all excited. I tell her, no, we're not getting a new church. We're definitely not moving to Florida because we're called to our other church. God speaks through the pastor, more or less, answers all my questions, which was a just to me was unheard of. And then I literally throw my hands up in the air. God, what are you trying to tell me? And he says, what do you think I'm trying to tell you? Shut up and listen to the sermon. I'm like, okay, I continue to listen. More questions get answered from the pulpits. This has to be God. And I tell Stephanie, I think God's calling us to move to Florida, because we're from Ohio. That's 1,000 miles away. She has 2 jobs. I have my own business and their side gig as well. We quit our jobs. We moved to Florida, jobless, and we started going to this other church. And it was an awesome mega church. And for those who might be listening to this, I have a lot of friends there, still do. And it taught me how to love people. Their motto was love God, love people. What a concept. And that, in a sense, kind of started my deconstruction, because I literally learned how to not be so close-fisted on all my religious doctrinal beliefs, and that there was some wiggle room. Like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And so we were there for 5 years. I was getting groomed to become a pastor, or at least a Bible teacher. I was supposed to join to apply for what they call the School of Ministry. Unfortunately, by that time, I was having way too many questions about the Bible. My wife was already going through issues because of something that happened to her on a mission trip while I was in Peru. She had separation anxiety. God was supposed to help her. Needless to say, the exact opposite happened. She went to biblical counseling for a couple years because of that. And I finally found out 2 years later, in basically 2018, early 2019, that I essentially have an atheist for a wife. I'm like, okay, this is a problem. But we worked through it. It was good. It was fine. So I had a lot of my own questions. I'm working through it, I think. And I would even tell you that in the first half of 2019, and my Facebook memories would attest to this, that I was challenging my faith because our pastor would say that a faith that isn't tested can't be trusted. And I like, hey, that's good advice. I had these questions. I need to act on faith and pursue these things. And that's what I did. And I would even tell you that my faith grew over time. Unfortunately, it became a balancing act. And then I realized that the Bible was not inerrant. It was not perfect. That caused me to rely more on faith itself, which I would say helps my spiritual maturity. And there's a lot of Christians that reside right there. They have destructed a lot of the fundamentalist religious bullshit, if I can say that. And that's a good place to be. If a Christian can say that they love God, they love Jesus, and is not in a harmful situation theologically, and essentially acts as a humanist, then fantastic. We're on the same page. But when they start making assertions that is theologically dangerous, and obviously there's some gray area there on what one would consider fundamentalist and what one would consider dangerous, then that's when we need to have a conversation. And my goal now is, I'm sorry, I'm kind of fast forwarding here, but I eventually became an atheist. I told God in a prayer that I can no longer consider myself a Christian. That was on October 9th. I wrote down a Post-it note, and a month later I was an atheist. And so I went through my angry atheist phase in December of 2019 into the beginning of 2020, and mellowed out a little bit. And now my goal is to not necessarily promote atheism, because I was kind of realizing that's what I was doing. I was basically becoming an atheist evangelist, and I didn't really want to do that. My goal is to help the church to understand that there are things within their theology, within the Bible, that is fundamentally, ironically, fundamentally dangerous to humanity and to people. And while I sincerely don't want to make more atheists, I do at least want to have the church be open and honest about what they're teaching and why, and that how they can realize that we might want to back off a few of these things, and how they can help implement these more humanist understandings through their theology, which I do believe is possible.
Great.
All right, that was really long.
Story.
So hopefully that was like 20 years. Just
I was gonna say it was a quick condensing. I'm sure you left out a lot of points, but I do have a lot of questions. If you're okay, I wanted to ask about. Could you go back to the point of your meeting your wife? Did you all at that point both agree that you were both Christians at that point, and that you were coming together as you said she was Catholic, but in the sense that you're both, believing in Jesus and the Bible. Was that pretty much the start of a Christian marriage, or did it feel like it was more of a secular perspectives at all that were already in it?
Oh, so it was definitely 100% spiritual. Like it had, I, so one of the things so first off, I met her at a swing dance,
Oh,
at a
cool.
college swing. Okay. And it was
Are
a
you any
Halloween
good at dancing?
swing dancing. Yes. So we haven't done it in a while because of COVID, but we do enjoy swing dancing on occasion.
Nice.
And so I literally had a Phantom of the Opera mask on. So that's how I got the in. I was able to see her that way. Turns out she loves Phantom of the Opera. So that was great. But I remember meeting her because I was so pissed off at the world. Something had happened, and I was being a very huge chauvinist. I was just pissed off at the world. I was supposed to close on a condo. It fell through, so I wasn't even supposed to be at this dance. And I'm like, I'm gonna dance with every single girl here, get as many phone numbers as I can, and not call a single one back. Like that was literally my attitude. Like it was horrible. And then I saw her across the way. There she was. I'm like, okay, all right. So this is gonna be interesting. And I'm like, nope, no God, I'm not gonna talk to her. Okay, I'll talk to her. I kept on feeling like this what Christians call the Holy Spirit nudge. Which honestly is not a lot different than your conscience. Like I can't honestly tell a difference. And eventually I ended up dancing with her. I did not end up getting her number, but we did some Facebook stalking together and we found each other. And I found out she was Catholic. And I'm like, okay, this makes no sense, God, because my perspective was like 99.8% of all Catholics are completely unsaved. Like they're hopeless. Of course, the one that I met, this happened to be one that was saved. And that kind of shows you the absurdity of some rationalizations that goes on within Christian understanding.
Just a quick question with the Catholics not being saved, which is very much what I grew up with hearing. Was that part of the Methodist background, or was that more of the other church that you went to in your teenage years?
Fundamentalists. The fundamentalist church. Like the Methodist church really has no spiritual bearing at all, really, aside from just knowing what it is to have like the people that are very loving. As loving at it's from rural. They're from rural Ohio. Okay, so there's a lot of cultural issues that go along with that. Okay, which I don't want to get into, but good old kind of like Southern charm. Like I know it's Ohio, it's not really Southern, but that's kind of the perspective that it is.
Yeah.
And, like we had the organists, and while I was going, there wasn't even air conditioning, and it had the stained glass windows and the wooden the works. Okay,
yeah.
So I understand how those churches operate very well, and but as far as actually retaining anything theologically from that church, there wasn't a whole lot.
What was the denomination of the second church you went to?
It was non-denomination, but it was very similar to Southern Baptist.
Okay. Gotcha.
It was very militant and very academic. Mm-hmm. And I say militant because militant may not be the right word, but it was very structured. Like it had a very strong hierarchy. And this is what you believed, and this is what you did not believe. Like these are the rules, and this is what you believe. Sort of attitude.
Yeah, at least if you want to fall in line with what God says.
Correct. And so to have that understanding of theology, there wasn't a lot of wiggle room for Catholics.
Yeah, that was very similar to my background, and it honestly made sense at the time. I've interviewed a few Catholics and certainly talked to a lot over the years. It's funny that some of them would say something very similar, like, yeah, it felt like all the Protestants were kind of wishy-washy, but it was like, especially even at Bible college where I went to be a pastor, it was very clear, like they don't worship the same God. Not that it's not the same origin God, but they add in the worship of saints. They certainly they're kind of making Mary the salvatrix. What's the word? Salvatrix or whatever. The co-savior with Jesus to a certain extent. That was getting an increasing measure. She's becoming more important, not just as someone you kind of pray to, but is actually part of your salvation. Right. Certainly not the same books. Your authority is not just the Bible. It's the Bible plus tradition plus the Pope. At least when he's speaking, ex cathedra, and it's like all these things that they'd add on. And then it was like, well, do you want this system? Did you hear from that church at all the idea that they were the actual the Book of Revelation's beast, or part of what the Antichrist would be? Did that get preached there?
There were some jokes about President Obama being the Antichrist.
Okay. Well, the Catholic
But,
Church for me growing up was that they were either the
yeah.
Antichrist or the beast, or just like they were the world system that was
Mm.
against the true gospel of salvation through Christ alone, faith alone.
Yeah. So we thought originally that the UN was probably going to be the 10 heads.
Yeah.
Yeah, which bogus. I was taught that the barcodes are going to be the 666.
Yeah.
Yeah. All sorts of crazy things.
It's amazing that you say that so much of that is kind of coming to fruition again. It seems like I've seen a lot of from the Christian friends I have and so forth on Facebook that they it's like a conspiracy theory, but they're kind of bringing it up again, like this is the end of the world as we know it, and these are the signs of the times. And it's kind of scary to think about how it's sad to think about how sadly they perceive the world, like it's just it's all about to end. So when you met your wife, though, or you met her at this dance, you were thinking she's probably the exception, she's probably a Christian. Did you actually talk through it with her and say, like, hey, how do you have peace with God? Like, what is that about? Or was it different? How was it working
that
through
would probably
those
been a
issues?
better way to do it. So I actually went to a Catholic service with her at her church, or at her college, and then I brought her to one of my services, and then so we're just chilling in like this commune room in her dormitory, and then I literally made like a compare and contrast sheet, because she's a biochemist, and then she went to master's degree in chemistry, so she's very analytical. And I'm like, this is what I can't remember what it was, but I made it very clear to her, like, which one is probably the more accurate faith. And then whether it's because of my dreamy eyes or whether it's because I actually made logic, I don't know. But anyway, she ended up agreeing with me, and she never went back to the Catholic faith. That was it.
Well,
so
that's pretty powerful charm there. You were
and I don't think it was my dreamy eyes or my logic. I'm not sure what it was. You had to ask her.
Yeah. Either way, so she kind of, at least in practice, was now looking more like a Protestant and evangelical. Okay.
Correct.
And that's where you entered your marriage in, as two Protestants.
Correct. I even told her that, for me to date a girl, to date a lady, that she would have to study her Bible every day.
Yeah.
And she started doing that.
Yeah.
Like, okay, all right.
Yeah. God's got to be love number one. He's got to be number one in every way.
And it's so cringe hearing it, but yeah, it was the truth.
Yeah. Well, what I was just curious, when you were starting that, did it feel like you had a lot of people around you? Kind of, you talked about being pulled into ministry a lot. Like, what was the expectation of where you would go at this point as Christians? Were you kind of being, not groomed in a bad sense, but just was there an expectation of, let's talk about ministry or missions or pastorate, or how did that work for you at that point?
It was very fluid. I was encouraged to originally sign up for the school of ministry 2 months after we moved to that church.
Okay.
Which I thought was incredibly premature, but I had a pastor tell me, yeah, you definitely should. And I even got the interview. So there was
when you moved to Florida?
Right. And so there was no talk about that when I was at my cult church, the fundamentalist church. But
were you open to that at all, to ministry?
Oh yeah. And I wanted to. I that's the whole purpose, is to go and make disciples. Like, when I was at the cult church, I was at the church, 4 or 5 days a week. It was the amount of time I spent there was ridiculous. Everybody, small church, 100 people, was doing all the work, and there was a lot of work that we did, a lot of ministries. So I would not make a decision that was not first filtered out by how it would affect my ministry at the church. Now, when we moved down to Florida, they encouraged couples to have more free time, which was kind of refreshing, and to have retreats and things like that. Yeah. So down in Florida, it was a little bit different. I did not end up getting added to the school of ministry, I think because they did not know me well enough, and that was smart. Like, I was surprised I even got an interview to join the school of ministry, which is like a 2-year program that they have. But from that point on, like, while the school of ministry was actually happening, I was being sent to some leadership courses. I was involved with, I think, close to a dozen different ministries throughout that 5 years. And with those, I think I led 3 or 4 of them. And one of them I actually created myself out of nowhere. It was a running ministry. And so I was being trained to reapply when it came around again. And one of the things that they do when you get interviewed is they also bring the wife in too and make sure the wife is on board, which is good. They should definitely do that. So they're very reasonable. It's a very large church. Like they know how to do church. Okay. A church doesn't get 10,000 people without, understanding how those sort of things work.
Yeah.
And it was just, I think the most fascinating thing when I first went there was the fact that they're actually teaching truth. Because while I was at my smaller fundamentalist church, like, big churches don't only exist because they tickle people's ears, as Paul puts it. They're not actually preaching truth. And I go to this church in kind of like a humble town here in Melbourne, Florida. Like, it's not a small town. It's not a big town either. It's got 10,000 people. Like, and there's not people walking out right now. I'm shocked. It was fascinating. But for the second round of school of ministry, I ended up not applying at all. I was having way too many doubts. I knew that my faith was too unstable to want to do it. And I was brought in to do a lot of volunteer work for the men's ministry, just a couple hours a week. And I don't call it the dark side of ministry, but I saw the very human business side of how a large church operates. I found it very inefficient. I found it very sexist. And even then I found it sexist. And I'm like, this is not what I want to do at all. Or if it is, I got to think really hard if this is what I actually feel called to.
At what point did the part come in about your wife becoming an atheist? Was that
was a process. So I went on my missions trip, I believe in 2017 or 2016. I think it was 2016. And that's a requirement for the school of ministry. So if you've already been on one, you're fine. But if you're going to school of ministry, you haven't done a mission trip, then you need to do one during that 2 years. And so I wanted to get out of the way. I felt called to do this mission trip, and I did it. My wife has separation anxiety from when I went to Iraq. And so this was a huge traumatic issue for her to deal with. And she relied on God to help her. She was very proactive in having a lot of women come and stay with her. When I left, we were literally 5 minutes, like a half hour before we left, we had a huge blowout. One of the worst arguments we have ever had in our life. Not exactly how you want to start a mission trip. And turns out like more than half of the ladies that she had scheduled to help come stay with her overnight or be with her while I'm gone ended up having to cancel. And so she was there overnight, multiple nights with no one to talk to. And that was very traumatic for her. And so I'm here in Peru. Thankfully, I have free international calls. I'm here in Peru trying to do my missions work. I'm also on the phone with her every night, trying to calm her down, trying to help her the best I can, pray with her, and it's just not working. And so that caused a very depressive downward spiral for her. She went to biblical counseling that the church offered. She went to some support groups that the church offered, but they're all very superficial. Like if you don't really know your Bible, and if you're just trying to get some general encouragement, it could help you. But she knows the Bible better than what these counselors did because she went to our fundamentalist church. And pretty much if you went to our fundamentalist church, you know the Bible better than 95% of the pastors in America. It's just a fact. Okay. We knew our Bible, and we knew our Bible. It was very fantastic with how well they taught us the Bible. They didn't teach us a lot of the history, as we'll probably talk about later. But we knew the Bible inside and out. And it just continued that downward spiral for her. And, eventually she stopped singing during worship, which was very concerning for me. And we had some very tough conversations, and just came to a point where, she's like, I just don't really believe it anymore. She didn't want to go to church. And so I just kind of concluded, oh, okay, I'm going to be one of those husbands who have an unbelieving wife. Not unheard of, but that's just where I'm at now. And so that was not fun.
With that transition, I'm making an assumption here, but I'm assuming that your religious background by that point was that unbelievers don't go to heaven, they go to hell. Was that part of your equation, at least in part?
Yep.
And so did she, when you would talk about that with her. Did she fear hell at all, or was it more like, I just don't think it's even real?
I don't know if she thought it was real or not, but she was just kind of to the point where she was so numb that she just didn't care.
Yeah.
Because she had put in for so much effort into this relationship with God, and she was getting nothing back. And I believe she came to the point where she just doesn't care. Like, if God wants to have a relationship with her, then she's there. She's waiting on him to, come talk to him. But it was kind of like the whole divine hiddenness thing. She put forth so much effort. She needed him, and he was just gone and did not seem to give a shit about her. And so she's like, why should I give one about him?
Yeah.
And if there is a hell, then whatever. That's kind of where she was.
It turns from a fight to just ambivalence at that point.
Right. And I also believed in, I think I still believed in eternal security at that point.
Okay.
And I was also starting to become a more liberal Christian as well. And so when I look at where Jesus talks about like I think it was the judgment seat of Christ, where the people say, Lord, Lord, didn't we prophesy your name? And Jesus is like, hey, I don't know you guys, get out of here. But then there was a people who were still doing good things, we didn't know who this Jesus guy was. And Jesus is like, hey, you guys did good things, even though you didn't even know about me. Let's go to heaven. I knew my wife. I knew she was a good person, and so between that rationale and the idea of eternal security, so even if she rejected God now, I knew she was saved. I knew she was a Christian. And if God's grace abounds, then, I'm not sure what level of heaven she'll be in, but I know she'll be there.
Yeah. Or even, I was going to say, I'm sure a lot of people in those cases have that hope that, if God is really the one that did this in the first place, meaning he gave her salvation, that, it does say in Philippians, I think 1:6, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion. Mm-hmm. And the idea that, God will use circumstances to bring people back to himself, whether it's through, discipline, as if it's like you're disciplining someone till they repent, or just showing, the overflowing glory of God comes through to the point where you can't deny, like, well, I don't even need to bow my knee anymore, like repentance. I can see God's glory. He's here. He's clearly in control, and he's clearly my savior. I was going to say, I don't know if you knew this, but I'm in the same situation, but in reverse. My wife is a believer, and it's definitely I'm appreciating hearing your perspective on it, because obviously I was the other person. I was the one that left first. But it's weird when you're in it, and you imagine, like, I don't think I ever imagined that scenario playing out when I was a Christian, of someone else around me that I dearly loved falling away, so to speak. But I could imagine, if I had thought through it, that it would feel really, really weird to think, how does this person that I, number one, still have to live with and interact with, and how does this person that I love, how does it work knowing that they're not part of this anymore? And there was almost like a privilege, I guess you'd say, in my family, even my extended family, where the majority of people, not all of them, but the majority were Christians. So like when we had a big family get together, where most of my family is up in Pennsylvania on my side, but we would get together there in Pennsylvania. 99% of the people were probably people that actually claimed to profess to believe in Jesus. And I remember thinking a couple of times, like, I wonder what it would be like if someone actually was like really completely not into this. And in a sense, I mean, I knew there was some people that were like kind of cold, but like someone that was like, I'm completely whatever, a different religion. How are we going to respond to that as a family when we do this family prayer with 20, 30 people, and everyone's bowing their head to thank Jesus for this meal? What's going to happen when one of us becomes a Muslim, or whatever? How are we going to handle that? Are we going to stop praying? And it was a weird thing to think through. But it's also, I didn't think through this issue, but it seems like it'd be hard for people to really grasp or work through the issue of saying, I think I'm going to go to heaven, and you might not be there. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to, according to the Bible, I'm going to be completely filled with joy overflowing. So I'm going to be in heaven enjoying the raptures of glory with Christ, while you're in hell burning, and I'm going to be completely happy knowing you're not there, but you're actually in a very bad place that, for my former theology, it never ends. A billion trillion years from now, you'll still be screaming in pain. And it's amazing to me that that doesn't bother people more. Did that become part of your thought process at all, or were you dealing with other issues by that point?
Well, I mean, I didn't have the luxury of trying to think about that sort of thing because, this is my wife. I couldn't think about that. I just, honestly, hell became an issue for me. And I imagine that the situation that my wife was in as a non-believer kind of, or again, it did subconsciously affect my decisions to research things more. But it was also very short-lived. I think the conversation with her being an atheist was probably in January of 2020 or 2019.
Okay.
And I believe by late spring, early summer, I had already deconstructed the idea of hell as a Christian. So I guess it would be safe to assume that her situation did strongly influence me, even though I didn't quite realize it at the time.
I want to ask about the deconstruction process, but could I ask, as you were like in the very first steps of that, like whatever you'd call step 1, 2, 3, or even just like the pre-steps where you're thinking, I think I need to start researching stuff, but I'll do it, as soon as I can. As you're kind of getting ready to do that or taking the first steps, did you feel at all like you were being blasphemous? And I know it's kind of probably an ironic thing that you run a platform called Heretical Theology now, but at that point, did it feel blasphemous? Like, I'm not sure I should be doing this, or almost like I remember as a kid, once I learned what a Ouija board was, it was like, don't you dare do it. Don't even think about it. Like, don't play with Ouija boards, even if you're just playing like as if it was a Monopoly game. Just don't do it. And so it was this sense of, if I ever saw one, I was like, I know not to touch that, like you just don't touch the electrical, don't stick a key in the electrical outlet. Was it like that, or did you feel like you were empowered by that point? Like, no, I'm allowed to ask questions. I'm allowed to double check stuff. How did that feel like to you at that point? Was it like you were blaspheming God at all?
No, I felt like it was a leap of faith. I mean, so I'm like, I trust God, like our pastor said, like, a faith that isn't tested can't be trusted. So I took him at his word. And I'm like, all right, let's do this. I got these questions. I want to figure it out, and I'm going to jump off a ledge here and start doing it, because I have been reading through the Bible every single day for 3 years already, going into the beginning of 2019. And so in January, I started doing a Bible 365 Devo on my Facebook page, and I would do them on my personal Instagram page too. And just to kind of like keep track of hey, I'm actually going to do this. And I literally did do it every day. I didn't post every day, but I posted probably like 90% of the time. And so it's fascinating. Like you can see my progression from me just looking at these Bible verses and saying, oh, how great God is, and be like, wait a second, this doesn't make sense to me, and I want to be honest about this. And so I would just kind of put it on the back burner, and you can see my questions I would have in those devos, and you see the evolution happen. Like it's not a perfect curve. It's up and down, but it's getting up there to where my critical thinking skills are just propagating the best of my faith. And so I did not view it as blaspheming. There was definitely some things I'm like, okay, I cannot touch this yet. And so I did not go to that area until I felt spiritually safe to do so. So one of the things that I did happen to stumble upon was Bart Ehrman. So it's kind of funny because I started working at a tech defense company with a lot of people in a big office. And so everyone talks, and I kind of realized that socially I'm a little odd. Okay. And this has a point. So I'm getting around to answering your question. And so that we all talk, we all learn. So I'm kind of relearning not only how to be a more reasonable, loving Christian through church, but I was also learning how to be a normal human being who wasn't a part of a cult. And I think someone even name dropped it, like, you're kind of odd sometimes. You really like your Bible. I'm like, yes, I'm a Christian. Of course I do. You're like it was a Catholic lady. She's like, well, I'm a Christian too, but you take it pretty far. I'm like, oh, I take that as a compliment. That was my attitude. And so we all started listening to different podcasts and reading different books. And then the dudes of the office, they all listen to Joe Rogan. I'm like, who's Joe Rogan? Like, you haven't listened to Joe Rogan before? Like, what do you do? Like, been under a rock? I'm like, maybe, I don't know. So I started listening to some Joe Rogan. I'm like, this is good stuff. Like, I like this Rogan guy. He's batshit crazy, but I like it. Like, it's pretty cool. Like, he gets out there and he asks really good questions, interviews really interesting people. So then he had a guy named Sam Harris on his podcast. And I'm like, oh, this is really cool. He's a brain scientist. Like, oh, wait, he's an atheist? All right, well, whatever. He's still saying some pretty cool, interesting things about science. I'm like, oh, okay. He has a podcast too. Well, let's check him out. That way I can learn more about science, because I actually was interested in science, even as a former, at that time, probably a still young Earth creationist. And that's when he had Bart Ehrman on his own podcast. And that was an amazing podcast. It was so great. And the entire time, I'm in complete denial listening to Bart say these things. For those who don't know, Bart Ehrman is a textual critic, former fundamentalist Christian turned atheist, classic story. And I eventually had to, I don't know if I did finish it earlier this week because I listened to it again, but I don't think I actually finished the whole thing back then. I had to stop. And because I learned what textual criticism was. And that to me seemed blasphemous, because the Bible was the inerrant word of God. I'm like, this is a problem. How can you criticize God's word? So I did what any normal Christian would do in my shoes, and that was to stop listening to the atheist textual critic and start listening to the Christian textual critics, because those you can trust more, right? And
oh man,
yeah, so I listened to a guy named I listened to a guy named Dr. Daniel Wallace, and I was hanging on every single word during one of his lectures about, is the New Testament reliable? Great lectures on YouTube. Highly recommend people go check it out, especially if you believe in inerrancy. And I'm listening to him, and he has a super long intro, and finally he says, is the Bible the word of God or the mind of God? Absolutely not. And my heart just sank. And I'm like, how could you say that? You're a Christian. How could you know the word so closely, the Bible? How could, you're the expert in this matter. How could you say that? And he goes into explaining it, and how we got 99.9% accuracy or whatever. And there's more. We have an abundance of riches is one of his cliche lines he likes to use. And so finally I saw another video where he debates Bart Ehrman. I'm like, okay, I need to listen to this. So I need to figure out what the hell is actually going on. And man, so it was actually a Christian that first really rocked my blasphemous perspective on inerrancy, to answer that question. So it was actually a Christian that did it. And then it was 5 rounds of Ehrman in that debate that really did me in. And I'm like, I need to learn what the hell textual criticism is and learn it really quick. And because of the nature of my job, I literally had basically 9 months to do nothing but just listen to audiobooks, listen to lectures, listen to debates about textual criticism. And I essentially got probably like the equivalent of a 2-year degree in theology and textual criticism in that 9 months. Like, I could not get enough of it. And it was fascinating. And that was definitely blasphemous.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that's where it starts, is just getting a little bit of that information under your belt. So I was curious, when you mentioned Sam Harris and Bart Ehrman, I got to ask, did you get to Christopher Hitchens at all?
Oh man, I love Hitchens so much. I have to reel in my love for Hitchens back a lot on my theology page, because it's very disingenuous for me to say that I genuinely want to try to work with the church to try to help them become more humanistic, while also being enamored with a lot of what Hitchens says, because he is an anti-theist and very anti-religion, and very rightfully so. In fact, probably my most favorite debate of all time is with him and Stephen Fry. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Debates an archbishop and a Catholic PM. I can't remember what the initial stands for, from England. And the whole debate is about whether the Catholic Church is a force for good or not.
Yeah, I know exactly the one you're talking about.
Phenomenal. Another must-see debate. because they had like 1,000 or so people listen to this debate, and then they had who was kind of like in the middle of the decision, who thought the Catholic Church was a force for good, and who thought it wasn't. And then like halfway through, they did like an analysis of where everyone's at, and there was definitely a small shift towards Hitchens and Stephen. And then they did, so they're like, then the moderator is like, all right, Archbishop PM, you need to work on this. All right, so and they're like, okay, because they had the popular majority originally, I believe.
Yeah.
And then I believe, if I remember correctly, because it's been a while since I watched it, it definitely completely shifted. Like, it was, the popular opinion was that the Catholic Church is not a force for good.
Yeah.
And the arguments that they both made was just brilliant and logical and factual and historical, and like it was so satisfying for me, also as an atheist, but as a skeptic and someone who's legitimately trying to be a good humanist. It was exactly what the world needs to hear and understand. Yes, there's good things that the church does. That doesn't exclude it from all the evil that it does. And that's no different for the Catholic Church or for the Protestant Church and all their 10,000 denominations. So, yes, I love Hitchens. And in fact, his book that he wrote on his deathbed, I did love that book. I actually read that all in one day because I was traveling back and forth like a madman between Florida. But the book Morality that he wrote when he was dying of cancer, he didn't even finish it. Spoiler alert. Man, that book was intense. When you have an atheist who's literally dying of cancer, who died before he even could finish the book, that tells you a lot about the sincerity and the honesty of what he was putting in those words. And there was I was dealing with a lot of health issues this year, very minor stuff. It was very annoying too. And I was just I have pity parties. And he has this quote in there. I'm going to butcher it, but I love it. It's, we often say to the cosmos, why we? And the cosmos respond back, why not? And it is just like the most badass statement that I think anyone could possibly make. Like, the universe does not care about you. It's going to keep on going. You are one microcosm of this thing we call universe, and you have this amazing experience called consciousness. And the universe is going to be here. It was here way before we were born. It's going to be here way after you're dead. Why should the universe care about you? Keep on going on, and it was for I guess for some people they'll find it very depressing. I found it incredibly motivating. I'm like, I'm complaining about these little health issues, and this guy is literally here dying of cancer. Okay, I need to suck it up here and be a little more thankful, and then realize that the universe doesn't owe me anything.
Yeah, I don't want to make too much of the interview about Hitchens, but just to piggyback up for a second, he did one against his brother. I'm sure you've seen it, but I love how the moderator said something like, and now we're going to switch to the subject of whether or not God exists. And Chris Hitchens, I'm going to give you 10 minutes to make your opening statement. And he starts by saying, he gets up and he says, I don't think it's going to take me 10 minutes to disprove the existence of God. And I mean, just laughter everywhere. But it was such he did a great job even with the few minutes he took. But then the other one that I appreciate, and I'll wrap up this part with this, toward the end of his life, he debated Tony Blair, the former prime minister.
That was humiliating.
That was great. But so what I love is, and I'll post a link to this beneath our video. Someone took like the best part of what Hitchens did in that, and they put it to some pictures and some music, and the video is called Atheist Anthem. Okay. And I mean, it will literally, if you're an atheist at all and you're compelled to fight against theism, it will choke you up. It's like, whoa, this is worth getting involved in. This is worth fighting for. And he did a great job rallying the troops to say, this is not just, I'm just going to walk away and be selfish. Like, get involved. This is hurting people. Fight this fight. Get people out of this. This is a prison. So I appreciate his perspectives on that. I was curious, and I don't want to ask too many questions about the interactions with you and your wife on the deconversion, because I'm sure there's some personal sides to it, but just in terms of this very basics parts of it, did you all feel like the lines of communication stayed way open for you to talk about it, or did it feel like it was hard, like was it painful at all to be like, wow, we're not on the same page anymore, this is going to have ripple effects, or did it feel like you could keep those, like, let's just keep talking through it?
Yeah, so we already have really excellent communication. Like, one of our big things when we were Christians was all about marriage. Like, whenever there was a marriage thing, we were there, and we even led some classes together. Like, that marriage was our thing. Like, that was like, we had a darn good marriage, and that was one of the things that we were known for. We were known for being that young athletic couple that really enjoys actually being together. With that said, did our communication become less? And no, it definitely opened up, but it also became a lot more painful and a lot more difficult. It's, you got to have those conversations, especially if it's your spouse.
Yeah. How do you approach it when someone who's going through something similar talks about it, either whether it's the Christian who's facing an atheist spouse, or the atheist facing Christian spouse? Do you find you're able to encourage people in that at all? Or I'm assuming too, there's probably some very discouraging situations like that, because I know with mine, for example, it's not an easy conversation at all. It's more like a eggshells kind of situation, and it's not super wonderful to have long term. How do you help people walk through those times, especially if it doesn't really come to a resolution where eventually both people are all on the same track, where it's like they're just staying on two different sides of the fence and they're not really merging their beliefs anymore?
Yeah, so obviously it's always going to be circumstantial based, and it is very discouraging. But at the exact same time, you got to realize, like, why did you fall in love with that person to begin with? That for those who are heavily involved in fundamentalism, it can be very difficult, because a lot of times the reason why you think you love this person has a lot to do with faith.
Yes.
And so I originally felt like I was going to be only able to love like a certain percentage of my wife, but that also kind of shows you how horrible evangelical Christianity can become. Like, you should love your spouse for who your spouse is, not necessarily for what they believe. Also, you're going to want them to believe things that you agree with, but the idea that it's always going to end in divorce or end horribly, that's not the case. Like, there are plenty of good, happy ending stories. There's a lot of stories where they do end in divorce. But it takes both people to be able to sit down and talk to each other. If you're a Christian listening to this and you have an atheist spouse, okay, you need to love that person, as much as you possibly can. Not because you think you need to win them back over, but because they're your spouse and you love them. I'm not against divorce, obviously, but I want marriages to work. Okay. And if it just may not work for some people, you may realize that when they're no longer a Christian, or you're both no longer Christians. So that's the other thing. I know people who both became atheists, and they're like, we have nothing in common. And they want to pursue like some very, like, one person may want to pursue like non-monogamous situations, and the other person's like, no, we are married. Like, obviously that's going to become an issue. And so there's so many layers, but it takes open communication. Don't end a relationship just because you have religious differences. There is so much more to being in a marriage than just religion.
Yeah.
And
that's good advice.
With COVID happening, like, my wife and I are both atheists together for like maybe a month. So I was an atheist starting like the end of November. So finally in December we're both atheists. Then COVID happens like basically like in January or February. And it's like, okay, not only are we both atheists now, we're trying to refigure out what we actually like. We can't do shit now. So we had a lot of time to try to figure out what the heck actually makes us happy. And it's still kind of depressing because we can't go out and do stuff that we like to do. Thankfully, Disney is open, so we go do Disney a lot. Which they, by the way, they do a great job down here in Disney with the mask and enforcing 6-foot distance. So shout out to Disney, great job. But maintain that communication. It may not work out. It may not work out for very good reasons, but it also may not work out for stupid reasons too. And you all need to have those conversations.
It's amazing to me too, just the way that, at least from my perspective as an atheist, when you do leave, you almost have to go through a process where you're reinterpreting everything. It's like you realize that you have interpreted life in almost every sense possible. The way you analyze a potential spouse, the way you analyze your job, your daily routine, your own self, with theology about who you are before God. You've put it through this grid for so long about how God sees us, how God sees our decisions and our personhood and our future and our relationships. And it's like, once you realize that none of that's real, it's like, whoa, like I almost have to I have to take some time to undo that, unweave this knot and get the table cleared and then start to figure out how to rebuild from scratch. And it's, everything from, understanding the implications of things like evolution and the understanding that, the earth is very, very old. Understanding that there's no afterlife, that this life is it. You die and you die. Understanding that people are not there for you, or your connection and desire to connect with them is not based on whether or not they agree with your belief system or not. All these things and many, many more, they start to become like this reformatting your hard drive. And it's hard, it's painful, because you realize some of this stuff is stuck so deep, it's got roots so far down. Some of it's hard to identify. And certainly I know there's people that deal a lot with just a theology that is actually painful to themselves. I feel like I must have dealt with some of that a little bit beforehand, because I don't feel like I had to undo too much of that. But I know people that deal with for years this question of like, I'm a worm before God, I'm undeserving and without God, kind of like in a one of those very narcissistic relationships in real life. Like God's like saying, if you're not with me, then you're nothing. That you're only valuable because I redeem you, because I'm with you. And that idea of realizing that, the way you find your worth and your value and your personhood, your identity, once you realize it's not wrapped up in all that stuff, it takes a while to redo it. And I think in a marriage context, it's so important just to go back to square one and say, like, who is this person? Who am I? And to get all that stuff as much as you can. I mean, I know some of it's just the roots run so deep, but to be able to say, get the poison out of our systems, take a breath, take a little mental vacation from it. It's like it's almost like you have to like do a little PTSD. Like, this has been an emotional, theological, traumatic situation. Take some time, recover, go to the beach in your mind, so to speak, look at the beautiful waves and the sunset, and let's hit the reset button, start over. And that takes so much work to do healthily, both to heal and to restart. And I appreciate that it sounds like you did a lot of that work as well. I was curious, as you went towards the tail end of your time in Christianity, what were those issues that when you dove into textual criticism and other aspects of it, what did come to light, if you can remember some of the highlights of it? I know there's a lot of stuff I'm sure you read and studied, but what were some of the main points that you went into that kind of took you out the most and just said, this doesn't sound right?
So when I was, so your mind kind of has to be in the right mode. If you're a fundamentalist Christian, so if you're a fundamentalist Christian and I'm talking to you and you believe the Bible is inerrant, and I told you, no, this here is a contradiction, like, you're not going to be open to that. Okay. Like, you're going to say, no, that's bullcrap. And rightfully so, because it's what you believe. Right. So when I was listening to the Sam Harris and Bart Ehrman podcasts, I was just listening as a third person perspective. Like, Bart made a comment about one of his papers, wrote a really good paper trying to rationalize this contradiction in Mark. And finally, the professor gave him an A, as this is Bart telling a story. But on his paper, the professor wrote, "But is it possible that Mark was just wrong?" So instead of like having like a 30-page gymnastics trying to explain this contradiction, what's more likely? Was it just Mark was just wrong, or that Bart's very elaborate, very well written, but also highly improbable explanation is true? And Bart was like, you know what? That stuck with me. Like, oh, maybe Mark could have been wrong. And that's when I asked myself, because I wasn't in that direct conflict. I was listening as a third-person perspective. I'm like, oh shit, could Mark be wrong? Is that possible? Like, it was just like this light bulb. I had this wall built up when dealing with Christians who didn't believe in inerrancy, or atheists that obviously thought the Bible was bullshit, and that no, this is not the issue. It was very, 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 very. There was no progress. There wasn't an open channel conversation. It was me trying to prove them wrong, and vice versa. Yet for me, listening to them, that proved to be an avenue for me to actually understand what was actually being said, instead of me talking at people. And so I use that tactic now when I'm conversing with people on Instagram, on Heretical Theology. A lot of times when I'm commenting to people, I'm not trying to comment to convince that person. I'm commenting to convince the other people who are listening to our conversation. I get super angsty. I have a lot of white, cis, hetero, white male fragility that I'm trying to work through. I fully admit it. I have it. I have an ego, and I get very defensive sometimes. So I'm working on that. With that said, I try to show the people that I'm talking to why they're wrong. Okay? That they haven't asked the right questions. Like, yeah, you could come up with very elaborate rationalizations for all of them. Trust me. I know. I said them myself. I know what the answers are. You don't need to preach to the choir who used to preach to the choir. Okay? I'm asking, what is it a satisfactory answer, or is the alternative more likely? And that's what happened with Bart. So that gave me pause to start researching things a little bit more. And then, ironically enough, a week before Palm Sunday, I start reading, I think it was a week before Palm Sunday, I start reading about the Ascension. I also had heard about the story of Romulus. And then I'm asking myself, it's very interesting that the Ascension story of Jesus in Luke is a lot like the story of Romulus. Oh, well, it's probably just, whatever, a coincidence, right? But then I'm also thinking to myself, wait a second. There is no Ascension story in Mark. There is no Ascension story in Matthew. There is one in Mark, but it's in the part that was actually not written originally in Mark. It was added on later. And there's definitely none in John. And there are actually two endings in John, and the author didn't put the Ascension in either one of them. If I'm trying to tell a biblical story about Jesus that I was an eyewitness of, I would write that shit down. This dude took off and went off into the sky.
Yep.
That's not the type of thing you forget.
And then I saw angels coming down afterwards. Yeah.
Exactly. And yes, I do know the Ascension story is also in Acts, but the same author who wrote Luke wrote Acts. So it's the same author.
Yeah.
So what's more likely? That Jesus rose up into the sky, conveniently a lot like Romulus, or Luke, who wasn't even there, who's getting these stories secondhand from other random people who we don't even know who they are, is trying to compare, or he got these stories from people who are trying to compare Jesus to someone who's like Romulus to make Jesus sound equal to or greater than Romulus. Because let's just face it, the Jews didn't really like Rome very much, and Romulus was the founder of Rome. So we want to try to make Jesus equal or greater than Rome. Because who was Jesus trying to save the Jews from as a Messiah? The oppressors of the Jews. Who was Rome? Are we? So hopefully we're connecting some dots here.
Yeah.
So what's more likely? That Jesus actually ascended into the sky, disappeared, say, peace out, have fun, didn't leave any instructions for us. Literally did not leave any instructions, because that's another argument I have for the Word of God. It's like, if Jesus is immortal, it'd be really awesome if he just stuck around like if there's some guy who's been around for 2,000 years and he's God, he's able to stick around and keep on talking with us, that would be pretty compelling evidence. Like I would love that. But he didn't. He just conveniently leaves. And Luke probably knew that and was like, okay, we need to have a good exit for Jesus. And he comes up with a story equal to that of Romulus. Whether he made it up, I don't know. Whether he heard it from someone else, we don't know. Supposedly there was hundreds of people that saw him, but we don't know who the hundreds of people are. That's literally the game of telephone. Like he said that, she said that, he said that, there were hundreds of people. So what's more likely? That was all made up and made to appear to be similar to or greater than Romulus, just like how these mythical narratives as oh shoot, what's his name? I'm having a brain fart here. Gosh darn it.
Richard Carrier.
Richard Carrier, thank you so much. Perfect, thank you. Richard Carrier, that's one of his. I love Richard Carrier too, by the way. I don't agree with everything he says, but he makes a darn good argument for the Gospels being complete bullcrap.
Yeah.
But they're essentially mythical narratives. They're not historical documents at all. They're not historical. When you look at actual historical documents, the Gospels look nothing like historical documents.
Yeah.
When you look at mythical narratives, like the story of Romulus and pretty much any other Greek mythological story, the Gospels look a lot like those stories. And they look like those stories for a reason, because that's what they are. They're not historical documents. And so it would make sense why you have these literally fantastic stories about Jesus, because that's what people did back then. They had their God and they personified him and say, this is how great my God is. And I'm going to put him in human understanding so that you can actually understand how great he is. That's literally what they did. When you look at the story of Zeus, when you look at the story of Hercules, any other Greek god or Roman god, that's what they did. And it was no different for Jesus.
And a lot of it, like you said, like the comparative mythology part of it, it's you have to really work hard to ignore it. And I know Christians do, to write it off. And I've seen some of the videos that they do of saying, oh no, Jesus isn't like this and that. But down to stuff like there were other religions talking about blood saving you, about being identifying with your dying and rising Savior God, about the way you get into this mystery, which Paul talks about a lot, the mystery of Christ. The way you get initiated in the mystery is through a baptismal initiation, and then you take, the community meals, and you become a brother or sister of the community. I mean, so much stuff that's so similar. And I don't think a lot of people realize this, and this is my biggest project on my plate right now, is a lot of people don't realize just how much is directly either copied or referenced or alluded to from other sources, not just in a generic sense of like, well, the story kind of went this way and Jesus' story kind of went this way, but like where you can look at the verse and say, like, this guy copied right out of Virgil. He copied right out of Homer. Like, this is the exact same phrase, or it's the exact same, like where I think you mentioned, Richard Carrier showing how it's not history, but like in Acts, like where the story of what Paul does lines up with exactly what, the Odyssey, that story, like where he went is where he went. And it's like, you can't ignore it without really being willing to be willfully blind, in my opinion. But my big project is I'm literally going through, like, I was never told as a Christian that the book of Enoch, which I don't think I knew almost anything about it when I was a Christian, but people never told me stuff like the book of Enoch is quoted over 100 times in the New Testament. Like, no one ever said that. And if someone told,
quoted that much, but it's quoted a lot.
No, it is. It's in my project. It is. It's over 100 times. It quotes Jubilees many, many times. It quotes Maccabees. It quotes others. They directly, or they're quoting a lot of other Greek philosophers.
I'll have to check that out now.
Yeah, I mean, they reference Aesop. They reference Pythagoras. It's like, and you add this stuff in, and eventually it's like, what's real? Like, what's left? It's just pure history. It's very hard to tell.
Yeah, Christians. So one thing that I noticed with the more popular preachers, they like to put Christians in the environment of the context of how the letters were written. Like, they'll say, pretend that you're listening to this letter from Paul. Like, you're in the room because that's how they were disseminated. And so it adds like that sense of awe and like connection to the author. I honestly think that helped lead to my deconstruction partially. There's literally like dozens of things that led. This is probably another aspect of it too. Now I'm thinking about it, because I'm like, okay, well, what else did they think back then? And I started learning about the history of the things that they believed. And They literally believed we're, for example, like in a snow globe back then. That's how they understood the Earth. Like, and I'm trying to think like how they understood biology, how they understood astronomy, and they believed that these gods were actually up in the sky. And when you have that historical context, especially when we read the book of Revelation as a socio-political document with Nero and Domitian and everything else, like it makes so much more sense than the nonsense that evangelicals try to preach today. Like, is it possible? I mean, I don't know how many zeros, like 0.000 I can give before I give like a 1% chance. I mean, anything I guess is possible, but how likely is it? Is that a satisfactory answer for you? And honestly, it really opened up my eyes to how easily people are duped for conspiracy theories. And I really learned that this past year with COVID and all these crazy conspiratorial things. And even for myself, like I was a younger creationist up until basically 3 years ago, I think. That was interesting. And I'm like, okay, I believe way too many things way too simply, and I need to understand how to process information correctly and how to actually look at historical facts, what a scientific fact is, have an open mind to be skeptical, but not so that I'm a hyper skeptic or I don't believe in anything or anything.
Right. Can we detour to that young Earth creationist stuff for a second?
Oh, there you go. I knew you were going to.
I don't deal with it too much in my interviews, but it is a fascinating piece of the puzzle. What was it like, kind of as certain doors were starting to creak open and you're starting to realize, like, it must have been like bizarro world to realize, especially the whole, number one, the age thing, like this place has been around for a lot longer than we thought, and number two, our origin is a lot different than I thought. Like what issues came to the surface as you thought through it?
There was a lot of cognitive dissonance where I was reading a lot more about science and different things, especially after I moved down to Florida, and people would say, oh, the Earth is millions of years old and the universe is billions of years old. I'm like, okay. One of the things that I rationalize as a Christian, and so if you're a Christian looking for a really good argument, here's a really good argument for you. Just how, so Jesus, when he made the wine with age. Okay, so we know that God is capable of making things with age. When he created Adam with age as a fully functioning adult human being. He created the earth with age. And so my rationale was, of course, the earth does appear to be that old. It would have to be. It explains so many things. It explains why there's light coming to us from things that are billions of years away, light years away, okay? It is literally a loophole to every single scientific argument against evolution or against creationism. So yes, when you actually do your scientific readings or whatever, however the heck they do those things, because I'm not smart like that. Yes, the Earth, the universe will appear to be that old, but it was still only created 6,000 years ago. That was literally how I rationalized it. So both are right. That was a nice little way of describing it. So
it's like God, like the stars that are billions of years away. God created the star, and it literally is billions of years years away. But what he did was he created the light in between, almost in a deceptive sense, so that he created everything that it would need to have traveled. It wasn't
deceptive. It wasn't deceptive because he created those stars so we could see and navigate by night. He was actually trying to help us.
Right. So what got you out of that line of thinking?
Again, I think it was being around normal people. Because again, when I was at my fundamentalist church, like I had a job and stuff, but I never really communicated with people outside of my church. Everything was done within church. And again, even when we went down to Florida, everything was still done within that church. Like I had my community group. We would have dinner together every other week and always doing church functions. But I became a part of because before I only worked for like very small companies of like 2 or 3 people in my office. Then I moved to this very large company and there's 40 people in my office. And you talk to people and then so many things, like I'm just listening. I'm like, I am not normal. Okay, I'm going to keep kind of hush my creationism because as a creationist, I made fun of flat earthers. Like, of course the earth's not flat. All right? Of course. But in my field, I was a geospatial analyst. Like, I would literally map the earth. And so geology and geography were very popular topics within my workspace. And then I'm like, I need to not tell people that I'm a creationist. Okay. Especially having a secret clearance. Like, that's just the type of thing that people are going to think you're crazy. And I was like, it made no sense whatsoever. And I won't say there was like a specific time when I stopped becoming a younger creationist. It definitely kind of just like faded out over time. And I'm like, yeah, it seems less and less likely. And then finally I was like, no, that's stupid.
So when you put the pieces together for evolution, what was that like? Was that shocking to realize, that our origins were not special creation?
Right, because all of the arguments I heard about evolution came from other Christians. Yeah. Okay, so when you only hear about from one side, of course, it seems like bullshit. But when I started reading, so I actually read The God Delusion by Dawkins. If you've been an atheist for more than a year, then The God Delusion is not the most amazing book in the world. But for somebody who the book was actually written to, for people who are actually questioning and trying to figure out truth and actually understand biology and evolution, for me it was incredibly helpful. And it helped me understand evolution and how to basically unwrap the creationist bullshit and understand it from a correct scientific perspective. So again, like, there's a lot of Christians out there who only look at things from a Christian perspective. Yeah. And if you actually want to understand the truth, like if you actually understand what atheists believe, ask an atheist. If you understand what an atheist believe, or a person who believes in evolution, who's a scientist, ask them what they believe. Don't ask a Christian what they believe.
Right. I think that part of it, that piece of the puzzle, is so critical for understanding, our origins, because once you open the door, I mean, it's really, there's a couple different ways that, like, you open the door a crack and a whole bunch of other things, a whole bunch of other bits of light come through the door. Mm-hmm. But evolution is one of them, where once you realize it, it's like, oh, so like the implications, eventually they start to connect. Like, that means that means that means that. And I love that experience. I've seen it in myself many times, and I love it when I see it in other people, where you kind of sit back and you see the wheels turning, and there's that, like, when you're a Christian, you're like, yes, Jesus, yes, the gospel, yes, salvation, yes, let's change, transform lives for God, yes, the power of the cross. And you're kind of going like, yes, 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 in your spirit, at least if you're on fire for Christ and you really, really mean it. It's not just a casualness. But there's a strong yes, and it almost irritates you when you see someone rooting for their college football team. They're like, yeah, go this, or the football team, whatever, hockey, and it's like, wait, aren't you on fire for God more than your football or hockey team? And that would annoy me. But what my experience was once certain connections hit, it was like, it wasn't like a loud yes, but it was like a full, like your whole body was breathing it, like, yes, this makes so much more sense. And I remember when I was watching, right around the time I had deconversion, I was watching a show where Ricky Gervais was being interviewed, and he's an atheist, and they were asking him about what do you think about the Bible? And he said something like, well, of course it's a man-made book, it's not divine. And then he went on to say something else about it. But it was like, as soon as he said it, like, all these contradictions that I'm grappling with, like, what do I do with all this stuff? It doesn't make sense, but I know God is God, and the Bible is inerrant. And as soon as he said it, like, well, of course it's just a man-made book, it's not divine. It was like everything in me, just like this whole deep, like, guttural, very real feeling of like, yes, it's not. I'm free to say it. It's not real. It's not a real experience. It's not divine. It's not God breathed. It's just human. And that kept on happening. Like, and I think that's where the cognitive dissonance eventually breaks down for a lot of us, is where you say, I just can't put this off any further. And the kind of like the risk to reward. It's like, well, I or maybe I should say level of effort to reward. I put in the effort with Christ, and I think I feel peace, but I'm not sure. I feel I put this level of effort to go to church and to read the Word. I think I feel like I'm doing the right thing, and you kind of like it kind of bolsters itself, especially when you have other Christians around you. No, keep going, stay strong in the Lord. And then, but like once you actually deconstruct enough, and then you start to put some real stuff in its place, it's like it really there's a depression that can occur where you're in the middle somewhere where you're like, this is like feels like such a loss. It feels weird. I thought I was going to heaven. No, I'm not. It's not real. There's a loss that can occur, but like once you start to actually get past it, and you're like, okay, I've got one life. I get to enjoy it. And most of my friends that I know are stuck neck deep in this cultish thing called Christianity, where they just are not even close to reality. Yeah. I escaped. Like I got out. Yes, like I may be poor as can be, but I hit the jackpot. I'm out of the blinders. The blinders have fallen. And it's just so cool when you feel that. And I remember here at this computer back in September 2019, it hit me all in an hour. I was just sitting here watching a YouTube video, maybe even Hitchens, who knows. And I mean, it was like someone strapped me down to a chair in front of a fire hydrant, opened that thing up, and it just hit. And it was like, it was like I was talking to myself, talking through like, I think this has ever been real. And I was like, it's like, can that be true? Like, is that possible? Can it not be real? It's like, no, it's theoretical. Like you have that first of like, it's theoretically possible that this was never real, that this was all made up, and we're all basically under a very big delusion. And it's like, can a delusion be that big that it's across the entire planet for 2,000 years? Is that even possible? This is such a big, talk about conspiracy theories. This sounds at first glance like, whoa, like 2,000 years, the whole planet, and none of it's ever been real? No, and you're like, no, I can see how it could have happened. I can see how it could have actually happened. And once you open it, you're like, shoot, that makes so much more sense. And it just, within an hour, I was gone, absolutely gone.
Now, it makes sense why there's so many people who are in on it, because it has to do with afterlife, it has to do with the death. And a lot of conspiracy theories remain very niche because they typically only have to do with people, one, who are obsessed with conspiracy theories, which is already pretty niche. But also it has to do with a lot of things that not a lot of people are actually involved with, like Epstein, however you say his name. Like, I think the memes are hilarious. Okay, I don't think Epstein killed himself. All right, but I also don't really give a crap who he is either, that much. I really don't. It does not actually affect me. Religion, however, has to do with death. That literally affects every single person.
Yeah.
And so there's always a lot of questions there. And so people want to, we are, you say delusion. I personally am skeptical to, or cautious to use that word. It's fine that you do, because I understand why you use it. But like for me specifically, I am naturally a truth seeker, and I thought I had that truth. And I had I don't want to use the word enlightenment, but I realized how ignorant I was and how much truth I don't actually know. Even though I had this certainty, this confidence and faith, I realized that my reasoning for that was very lacking. And I think pretty much everyone on this earth, in some way, shape, or form, has that same desire to know truth, to have confidence in where they're headed and what they're doing. And they just want to know what's going on. Yeah. And I can't blame them for that.
For sure.
So hopefully that makes sense. Trying to give a little bit of grace to all the theists out there. It's just like, I get it. I get why you believe in God, or why you even feel it's necessary. For me, it's just no longer necessary. And, as you just said here, it's very freeing to no longer need that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of freedom in saying, I don't know.
Yeah. And I think to be the freedom to be able to allow all the facts into the discussion, to say there's so much more about the origins of the Yahweh character, of the Bible itself, of Jesus, of Christianity, so much more that we don't talk about, that we now have the freedom to put all that information out there, on the table as we talk about it. And I really do think, if this is pure conjecture, but I really do think that if it were theoretically possible to take a lot of Christians and to, you know, kind of use that Men in Black thing where, you know, you
Mhm.
hit the thing and they forget everything. And all of a sudden they're like, you know, Jesus who? I've never heard of him. And then say, look, I want to tell you about something really cool. And you just walk them through everything, not just the Bible, but you walk them through the whole origins. I think a lot more people would be like, I hear you. Yeah, I mean, being in heaven and being perfect and no pain anymore, that sounds kind of nice, but just this whole story doesn't add up. Like, where's the evidence? Where are the historians? You know, I see when you walk me through where the Christians say there's historians from that time that talked about him, but now that you told me the full story, I'm like, there's not actually that much evidence at all for him, and that, you know, there's so much more that the Christians didn't tell me, and I think a lot of people would just be like, I'm going to have to dig into this. This doesn't sound right. And it's amazing to me to realize, or to see people that finally give themselves the freedom to say, and it's hard. It takes a lot of bravery, but just to say, I've always been in this spot where God is the judge. God tells me what to do. I'm not trying to be, you know, on blast, or, you know, the one who's calling all the shots. I don't want to be like, oh, God was my captain and now I'm the captain. You know, screw you, God. But just to say, I am free to be the judge of the facts. Like, I will actually get all the facts and then make the best decision. I know for some people it's easy. For people like myself, and I think some people who went through certain types of Christianity, it is so hard to give yourself that freedom. It's so hard.
Right.
It feels so like, oh, what am I doing? I'm attacking God. How can you attack God and not get in big trouble for it? What was like the outcome for you? Like, once you said, you know, I've looked at all these texts, these things don't make sense. I think I'm not Christian anymore. Yes, I'm definitely not Christian anymore. Like, what were the pain points? Was it depressing, like we talked about earlier? Was it sad? And then how did you start to rebuild once you were at that point?
Yeah, I mean, so it was very sad. Like, I am fortunately, again, I had deconstructed the idea of hell before that, mostly ironically thankful to Yale open courses online. So that's another great resource for people to check out. So Yale has these online courses, and they're free. It's not a credit or anything, but you can. So that they have a New Testament and Old Testament course, and so it's like 20 plus courses. They're each 45 minutes long. It's an actual recording from the classroom.
Yep.
Go check them out. They're invaluable. If you care at all about the Bible, you need to watch this thing, because you're not going to hear this being taught at church. It's not theological. They talk about the theology, but it's not a theological class. It's a historical class about the theology and about the Bible.
And I'll
Go
put the
watch
link to that beneath our video.
Thank you. That is invaluable. So that Old Testament course, essentially, after I took it, I'm like, I don't believe the Old Testament is inspired at all anymore. There's no reason for me to believe in it. And along with that came hell, because Sheol, of course, is a big part of, you know, believing in hell. And then when I realized more about hell in the New Testament, that's when I deconstructed the idea of hell. Like, there is no eternal conscious torment. There's entire books written on this. Bart Ehrman's book, again, Heaven and Hell, is a fantastic book. But to make a long book short, the reason why I dismissed the idea of hell was because in every text that talks about hell, it's either metaphorical or the torment itself. The place in hell is eternal, but the torment itself is not. So that's the thing. You got to realize that. Yeah, so the flames of hell will go on for eternity, but the things tossed in there, it says nothing about the things being tossed in there is torture for eternity. So we have an understanding of how the Jews understood hell, or Sheol, which I don't want to get into because we're short on time. It was essentially annihilation, is what they believed, and what that seems to be what the historical Jesus, was actually trying to teach. And there is a very strong historical case for that, a strong textual case for that, and let's just say a strong philosophical and probable case for that. And which, if you understand what annihilation is, it's really no different from what atheists already believe. It just means we're not going to be in heaven. And for a lot of atheists, they don't want to go to heaven anyways. So there we go. So to answer that question, sorry, that was a long way to get around there.
That's an important topic.
The only pain that I experienced was the loss of my best friend Jesus, of the comfort of having him to talk to. I would it was like muscle memory. Whenever, so after I would pray myself to sleep, even though I said I wasn't a Christian. I'm like, God, if you're real, please be real. Not because I'm afraid of hell. That's why I said all that, because it wasn't a fear of hell. A lot of Christians like, you're just afraid of hell. I'm like, no, I really wasn't. Like, that's not the case. I legitimately miss my relationship with Jesus, and it was like mourning a loss of a friend. And I would find myself like, when something would happen, I would instantly start praying about that situation, because that's what you're supposed to do when you're a Christian. I'm like, wait a second, I don't do that anymore. And I'm like, instead of just praying about it and tossing it away, I'm just going to stop. I'm going to meditate, just clear my head for a second, calm the fuck down, and be like, instead of just tossing this and leaving it to fate to figure it out, which a lot of times that's really all you need, because most of the stuff that we stress and worry about end up being non-issues anyways. Conveniently, that's kind of how prayer works too. But anyways, sorry, a little tangent there. I would stop and think about the situation logically. I'm like, is this something I actually need to worry about? Is there anything that I can do to fix the situation? If there wasn't, there wasn't. Okay, great, problem solved. We'll just see what happens. Then if there was something I could do about it, I'm like, okay, what can I do to actively figure this out? And it forced me to become a lot more mentally capable. It was pretty eye-opening, realizing how mentally unexercised and ignorant I was, and how damaging prayer actually is. I should probably do a post about that too. Now I'm thinking about it, because I haven't done one about that yet. So that's good. And I'm like, I need to stop just giving stuff to God and figure this crap out. And there's a lot of Christians that simply don't do that, and they need to start doing that. If not just for their own mental health, because of, if there are actual health issues or situations that you need to take care of, and you're only relying on prayer, that's a problem, and you need to figure that out real quick. Yeah. That was a pain I experienced, but that pain grew into something that made me much, much stronger.
I'm curious, did your wife ever kind of either rejoice in your decision, or was it like I kind of thought you'd end up that direction, or was there any kind of response or did you feel happy to be on her side now? Or
yeah, it was kind of relieving, because it would have been miserable for me to be a Christian and her not to. Let's just face it. I know, again, the whole spiel about communication. I don't know how our marriage would have worked out. We still essentially don't believe in divorce for us. We're okay if other people divorce, but I just can't think of anything that my wife would do that would actually cause me to want to divorce her, because I don't think she ever would, and vice versa.
Yeah.
But that would have been a tough situation for us. And so we're thankful. You know, we find ourselves very fortunate we ended up in this situation. But I'm also not really surprised, because we kind of hopscotch each other quite a bit. Like, I become really interested in something, then she ends up becoming interested in it. And it just kind of happens. Like, for a really good example, she's really interested in books. Now, finally, I'm really interested in books. I was never a book reader. I'm still not. I listen to a lot of audiobooks, but she thinks that counts. So that's good. But now she's super athletic. She's like, you're never, ever going to get me into a gym. Now she's running Spartan races with me. Okay. It's like, we change a lot, but like, it's like we change, but we weave around each other.
Yeah.
And awesome. There was definitely some sort of synergy between us through this situation. I know I did not deconvert from Christianity because of her. If anything, I deconverted from Christianity because I was trying to help her and help her understand. But she left Christianity for completely different reasons than I did. And there was no sincere moment where she was just overjoyed, because it was such an organic process that happened over time. But we do look back at it now, and we love having a couple good laughs at our evangelical selves and all the stupid things we used to say and believe.
I love that your story with that, because it's such a cool thing. It reminds me of one of the gentlemen who helped me a lot to earlier on to get out of Christianity. He didn't try to get me out. He was a very liberal Christian, and I thought he was liberal. He was probably not even really a Christian, but he's a guy that was really big into greyhound rescue, and he has a bunch of greyhounds, and he and his wife do this event called Grape Hounds, where they take greyhound groups to wineries. It's called the Grape Hound Wine Tour, and greyhound lovers, they come all over the country from all over the country to do it. And the greyhound community is very, very tight knit. And he had asked me years ago, or I'd asked him rather, where are you with God? And he said, well, let me just ask you this, Tim. This was like 10 years before I deconverted. He said, does it make sense that God would speak to just one little tribe instead of to the whole world if he really wants to tell them about who he is, how much he loves them, what salvation's about, what, really reality is about, especially in the afterlife? Does it really make sense that he speak to one little tribe and not to everybody at the same time? And then he's just real quiet for a long time. And then when he finally speaks a second time, he doesn't go like to the other side of the planet. He just ironically goes to the exact same tribe, the little tribe. And again, try number 2, as opposed to telling the whole world. And at the time, of course, I had Christian answers. I was more of a heading towards Calvinism at that point. God elects, God elects. He does what he wants to do. But his wife was the same way, where she was the one that loved greyhounds first, and she was like, yeah, I guess so. And now he's more of an enthusiast than she is. He'll drive 6 states away to go rescue a greyhound. He loves them.
There you go.
Well, I was, in terms of a final question, I wanted to ask about the subject of sexuality a little bit, in two areas, and you can pick how much you want to say about each one. But the first one is the question of, a lot of Christians deal with the issue of shame, the shame culture, the purity culture. You've posted a little bit about that recently, even. For anyone that doesn't know what purity culture is, could you just briefly define it? Could you talk about what it can do? Doesn't do the most damage that it can do to everyone, but it does do a lot of damage to a lot of people. Could you tell what that damage looks like from what you've experienced or talked to with people? Did any of that affect you personally? Did you deal with getting over the shame issue as you escaped? And then the other question I was going to ask after that is how did that evolve into a respect for people who are not heterosexual, or just the way that you were as a Christian? How did that evolve as you went from just beyond just, okay, this is, sexuality is not from God, and I don't have to do it to honor Jesus in the way he says, whatever. And once you get past it, you start to realize there's ramifications, what you believe, ideas do have consequences, that kind of stuff. How did it evolve into being more respectful and open to realizing that we've got to see the sexuality thing differently?
Yeah. So purity culture, for me, was just a way of shaming who you are naturally, which is ironic because that's the way God made you in the first place. I can't really speak to a whole lot because a lot of it has to do with women and is typically men who does the shaming towards women. But of course, there are things within within males that have their own sort of like purity culture thing. Like, I was a guy who went in the mall walking by Victoria's Secret. I would like walk around to the other side of the hallway, then walk by it with my hand up, making a whole production out of it, making sure that I don't look at what I'm not supposed to look at.
Yeah.
Of course, pornography was a constant issue. It was kind of weird because it's just that whole thing. There was, I feel like half my church life was just like spent like confessing about, just male issues, and it's like really obscure private things that probably shouldn't be talked about so openly with random people, or even people that so closely or so flippantly. So there's that extreme, and then you go from another extreme to, you're always talking about it, but you're not even supposed to think about it, because while thinking about it's not the sin, it's acting upon that's a sin. But I was taught that sin begins with a single thought. And so I'm literally like becoming my own thought police, from 1984. I'm literally guilty of thought crime.
Yeah.
And there's no escaping that. And so while I'm trying to remain pure for myself, I'm also, it seems counterintuitive, but I'm also objectifying women at the exact same time, because, oh, wow, now I'm already super sensitive and not acting upon how I'm naturally supposed to do, thinking that's evil. And now I'm like projecting that onto women, thinking like, okay, they shouldn't be dressing like that. That's a problem. That's a multi-layer problem. But who was necessarily very sexually frustrated throughout my entire teenage years and college years, trying to restrain that, thinking I am doing myself a favor for God while also trying to become a good Christian and treat women correctly as God wants them to be treated. It's the complete opposite. Yeah. So there's definitely some brainwashing there, and it's 10 times worse for ladies. It's so much worse. Like, I literally had nothing to complain about, really. But there are stuff that men definitely suffer from within that culture.
It really creates a double life for a lot of people where they can't not think about it, but they have to play the game. They have to look good on the outside.
Mm-hmm.
And it's amazing, just that idea of, when you bring things into the light, they lose their power. But when you live a life where it's just darkness and shadows, I don't want anyone to know the real me or what I'm really thinking. Boy, it's almost like it's like a psychological study of like how to really mess with people's minds.
Absolutely.
By giving them this. It's like giving them something so powerful and saying, this is at the same time a gift from God and so beautiful, but it will blow up in your face if you don't handle it just right, like a stick of dynamite. And yeah, you should love it. And the minute you get married, you should just absolutely just totally thank God for this gift and enjoy it.
Yeah.
But every minute before then, you should almost act like it really doesn't matter. And the reason that you're pursuing this girl or that girl is just purely because you want to, raise a family for the Lord, and she's really going to be good as a helper in ministry. And just like, you can't admit she's beautiful, and she's lovely to look at. She turns me on, and I can't. I'm very attracted to her. That kind of thinking just feels so fleshly and so worldly and so sinful, and you cannot admit it. Or if you do, it's to that one-off, accountability partner that you can share your whole psyche with, and that you kind of agree to keep it private. But in terms of the public, you can't really tell people what's really going on.
Right. No, I totally agree. And it's like, it's really unfair to ladies. Like, we teach them to be super modest, cover up, do this, do that, don't be promiscuous or anything. Then on your honeymoon night, be a freak in the bed. Like, that's not how reality works. And it's totally unfair against women.
Yeah.
And that's a standard that the church makes for women.
Yeah. I often felt too like it almost makes women ashamed, especially women that might find it harder to dress modestly for whatever reason, because of the way their body type or whatever. Like, if you have anything about you naturally or in the way you dress that does turn someone's eye, you really need to kind of pull that in and figure out a way to make yourself look almost more masculine. And don't let the flirtatious or whatever, don't let the curves become the stumbling block, because these are your brothers in Christ. You have to help them look at Christ, not at flesh. And it's so weird.
Yeah. Then to answer your question about homosexuality in the LGBTQ community, it was also, I think, in 2016 or early 2018 where I had learned to essentially accept them as Christians. But my wife came to know a lot of bisexual and homosexual people, and they're awesome. Like, they are really cool, and they're some of the kindest people that we've met. And you compare that to some of the people that she's also met in church, many people she's met in church who were also some people that abandoned her. And she's like, I want to hang out with them more than these people. They seem to like me for who I am, who was, my wife has a very strict personality type, and she doesn't always connect with people very easily. I'll just put it that way. A lot of people like her, they like being around her, but not a lot of people seem to actually want to put forth a lot of time and to actually get to know her very well, and that kind of makes her sad sometimes. I think she's okay with me saying that too, because that's the truth. And yet she got those connections, through that community group, and especially because she likes to dress vintage and things like that, and that's very popular in that community. And it was just very fascinating just being with these people and just seeing how genuinely loving and caring they are. And I'm like, I cannot see this person going to hell. There's just no way, just because they disagree with me theologically. This is a problem. And that was also kind of part of that, was a spiderweb connection to deconstructing hell and the nonsense that it brings. And I also knew lesbians that I used to work with that were Christians. They profess to be a Christian. I'm like, I wonder how that works. And so finally, I had this, again, cognitive dissonance. I'm like, I believe homosexuality is a sin, but I'm also having issues with thinking that they're not going to hell. Like, what? Screw this. Why do I actually believe this? Why do I believe they're going to hell? I'm like, oh, because you're taught that. I'm like, okay. Well, let's figure out what the Bible actually says. So the New Testament professor from that Yale course that I mentioned, his name is Professor Dale B. Martin. Super hilarious guy. He is a great professor. I love his classes so much. I actually got to talk with him a little bit on email because I had some questions when I was deconstructing. And I finally bought his book, or I actually got it as a gift. His book was called Biblical Truths. A really good book for people who's trying to rationalize theology. He doesn't want to become a full non-Christian, but also wants to have a good understanding of theology of the Bible that you can rationalize today. Great read. Is very challenging for me as an atheist. I like it. I don't agree with it all, but it's still very fascinating. Anyways, he is a homosexual, and he said as much in his course, like right there on camera, like in the middle of the class. It was so funny because the class is going through what Paul was talking about in marriage between a man and a woman. And the class is not responding because this crazy weird question, and he's like, "Hello, I don't have to worry about this because I'm gay. So I'm asking you guys, what do you think about this answer?" It was just so freaking hilarious. This is a Yale professor who just straight up said that in the middle of his class. I'm like, that is great. That was hilarious. And so the more I learned about the term homosexuality, I realized that homosexuals actually not in the Bible. There was no term for it. It was actually a word that Paul actually made up. And when you learn more about Roman culture and the dishonor that Paul was talking about, trying to figure a good way to compress this. I have a blog post about it on my blog, which I don't really update anymore, but it's on my Instagram. Essentially, the way Romans understood biology completely invalidates the homosexual argument. They thought women were lesser men, that they were literally underdeveloped men, and that men were superior. Okay. So, for example, they thought a woman's hair was a sexual organ, right? And so when a man penetrated her, like the long hair was supposed to help pull his seed up into her and make her more fertile. That's why long hair was very popular. That's why Paul says your long hair is for your honor. And also why, hey, you should cover it up, because it was also a sexual organ. It was immodest to show off your hair. So if people are worrying about the whole hair covering thing and Corinthians, I can't remember which one it is. That explains that for you. So there you go. Stop take off your hairpiece if you wear a hairpiece. Okay, you don't need to wear it unless you actually want to. Completely your choice. I'm not going to tell you what to wear. So what does that have to do with homosexuality? It was the man's role to, I'm going to be kind of crude here, but it's good terminology, and this is what Dale Martin talks about in the Yale course. It was the male's job to penetrate the woman, or being that subservient role. So the idea that what Paul is talking about is dishonorable to be in that position, to be in the person who's being penetrated. That is dishonorable. And also the idea that especially sodomy, if you're taking it that way, that's not how you get children. That is also dishonorable, because sex should be glorifying to God, and you should do that to grow children, to have children. So it had nothing to do with being a homosexual. There was no term for homosexuality. They knew that there was men who were attracted to men and ladies to ladies. That's not what Paul was talking about here. He was talking about the person accepting that submissive role, being in that role, and then also being a person doing the penetrating. Like, it is wrong for you as a Christian to dishonor that person like that. You should not do that. So if you're trying to figure out what the hell is Paul is talking about, you need to understand the historical context, and you need to understand the textual context, because that is what Paul is talking about. He's not talking about people who are just straight up flaming homosexuals. Not at all. So unless you want to use archaic, ancient 2,000-year biology to support your faith and essentially your bigotry, then I can't help you. But if you actually want to understand historical context and why you're wrong about thinking homosexuals are going to hell, there you go.
I've often thought along those lines that it must be very difficult for people who have been given the party line about, what they have been told the Bible says about homosexuality, that when they deal with those issues, as they grow up and realize, where they feel like they land on that, if they don't fall into the traditional party line, that they're not, heterosexual, and they're not going to basically look like maybe most of the people around them, that they're, number one, going to face a lot of community ostracization, but just the idea that not only is your community going to give you grief, maybe even intense grief or shunning, but their very creator, it's like an implication that you are so twisted and broken and self-deceived, so to speak, about and ignorant of God's plan, of God's design, that you're twisting, you're turning everything on its head. You're twisting God's whole story, his whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of being able to merge that and say, I want to still be a Christian with this, I can't be because God hates this. Number one, that's a hard, you can't merge them. For a lot of people, they walk away, which I understand. But then the other part of it is just, even if you walk away from some aspects of the theology, just you're left behind with this feeling of, I'm so subpar. I'm so outside of the community. The difference is just, it's a big condemnation, and it must be so hard for people to just think through and say, the definition of healthiness that I was, the bar that was raised to me, this is healthy. Anything else, it doesn't fly with God or with us. And to realize that it's so twisted and distorted, and not just with homosexuality, with a lot of other issues, but to realize what we were told as healthy, what we're told as normal, what we're told is the design, like as if there's some master design to it all. None of it's even applicable. And just to be able to how cool it is to be able to start to unweave that knot and say, this was never unhealthy. Like it's almost like, just to be more generic, like there is no such thing as heresy. There is no such thing as blasphemy, because if the God doesn't exist to blaspheme, then it's just a figure of speech to say,
well, that is a heresy, so there is heresy.
Well, I mean, to them, yeah.
I see.
But like where Paul says,
I know what you mean.
Paul says in Corinthians, what's the big deal about sacrificing to idols? There is that idol does not represent a false God, because there is no false God. So go ahead and do it. And of course, whoever was interpolating later says, but we don't want to have anything to do with false idols, so don't do it. And he kind of fights against Paul within the same book, whoever added it. But it's like Paul's point at first was like, this doesn't matter. It's a nothing. It's a null. It's a zero. And it's like the idea that there's never been a pattern. There's never been an overarching design. There's never been a structure that says, this is the way I made it, please fit into this. It just doesn't exist, apart from what our society has imposed. And just the freedom that it must be to finally realize it's not there, and just the frustration. And I'm even beyond sexual issues. It's frustrating to me that so much of our society has been defined by this stuff for so long, and how cool it is to realize, like, there's a whole different paradigm, And I'm sure some of it I'm not even aware of yet, of just how different life should be seen. So many issues, and hopefully we can maybe touch on them in another interview, but there is a freedom and a joy to say, I have a purpose in life. It does not derive from a deity. It doesn't derive from an ancient book. It doesn't derive from what my church or my pastor says. I have a purpose, and I get to define it. I get to drive it. I do get to be the captain of what I'm going to do with whatever time I've got. And I wish people who've gone through that shaming so much healthiness and just an ability to take the time you need to heal from it. And I'm certainly sorry for what we as a church have done to certainly not make that a very easy path. I'd say it's my shame, because I was certainly, fortunately, passively part of that, but I was not making any healthy inroads to make it a better place. So
same here.
I really want to say thank you for what you're doing. I hope everyone will go to your channel, again, Heretical Theology. The links will be beneath this video. And I see what you post on Facebook. It comes right up. I see it a lot. I love it. You have this thing you do where you take either a sentence or a phrase, or maybe even a couple sentences, and you break them up sometimes. But you take profound thoughts. I think most of them are just, they're not quotes, they're just stuff you're coming up with yourself, right? And it's just you come up with these thoughts, and they have such profoundness to them. And it's literally like you take this stuff and you can just kind of chew on it all day. It has depth and impacts that make so much of a difference. And you do it pretty regularly. I think I see something come through my feed every day or so.
Awesome.
I
I'm glad
love
to hear
it.
that.
Yeah, it's keep doing it. It's awesome. It's great. It's like a contrast where you do like a black background with white or gray words. You make it pop visually, and it doesn't just pop visually. It pops intellectually. For anyone that's really wants to have some deep thinking, if you were used to as a Christian, going to C.S. Lewis or some other person that just could just really drive these deep thoughts. Will's platform, which I'll give links to, it'll bring things that'll pop, and it'll make you think, you know what, I haven't thought enough about that issue. There's a lot of stuff here that I need to reprogram, and your channel absolutely helps us reprogram and get back to some healthy levels. So thank you for doing that, everyone.
Yeah.
Please subscribe and like and everything to Will's platform. And any final thoughts you want to add to our discussion here before we wrap up?
No, thank you so much. I really appreciate those kind of words. Thanks. I really appreciate it. And then if people are looking for me, I do post myself on Facebook. I'm 95% more active on Instagram.
Okay.
And that's heretical_theology on Instagram. And just come and say hello and let me know that you found me through this YouTube channel.
Awesome.
And podcast.
Absolutely. Well, again, everyone, Will Thorpe. Will, thank you so much for what you do and your platform and your voice in this. I hope it gets louder and louder and a lot more people listen. Appreciate what you're doing. Thank you for your time today.
Cool. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.